today we are going to talk a little bit about security studies. This is probably the conversation we'll have besides like the feminism conversation that's like most directly applicable to some of the critiques that you're going to hear next year, as well as at camp. Like the security K is going to be the genero K on next year's topic. And so understanding security theory is very helpful at understanding like the actual premise of what people who are reading the security K are saying. Because it's going to be the genero K on the topic, there are going to be plenty of people who don't at all understand it.
Was like SEC called the generic one last year? Was like SEC called the generic one last year?
CAP, SEC call. CAP is usually like the generic one unless we have an IR topic where we can talk about security.
Okay.
And so like there are going to be a lot of people, especially younger debaters, who like don't understand what they're saying at all. But like it's the generic K, it's the one we have a 1 in C for, it's the one the older kids make blocks for, and so we're going to read it. And so understanding it better than they do is a really good way to beat them on it. So first things first, we need to talk about when securitization theory really came into its own. So we've talked a little bit about the trajectory of international relations as a discipline. For a while it was just realism for like hundreds of years, up until the First World War, where people were like, well, that was bad. We did not like that. And that's when we came up with liberalism as a way to try and stop wars from happening in the future. And then World War II happened. And realism had its big renaissance moment where it's just like, see, we were right all along. And then the European Union became a really prominent international organization as sort of the United Nations. And so then liberals were like, see, we were right all along. And it's also around this time, so like really post-World War II, a little bit before World War II, but really heavily post-World War II, where IR scholars start looking at other disciplines of critical theory, and they're like, actually, you know what, I do think that Marxism has something interesting to say about our international relations context, or I do think feminists have something interesting to say about our international relations context. And that just leads to this like flooding of not queer theory specifically, of critical theory into the IR field as a whole. So one of the additions that we have here is securitization theory. Now securitization theory isn't usually lumped in with critical theory just because it is less concerned with specific types of oppression, and it's more like, what if realists thought a little more critically about some of their assumptions? Especially when we talk about things like self-fulfilling prophecies, serial policy failure, all the buzzwords that you're going to hear at the top of the K in the 2 and C overview. And so one of the things that people were really trying to continue to explain was like just how the world was supposed to work during the Cold War. We had all these ideas about how the world worked. We had these empires that had basically kind of run things for hundreds of years, thousands of years really, up until World War II. And then we begin the era of decolonization, or of all of these empires being broken up. But that doesn't actually make the empire itself go away. Not exactly. We still end up with these hegemons. Some of them are global hegemons, like the US and the USSR. Some of them are more regional hegemons, like France or England or Japan. Not so much Japan after World War II, but they'll get back up there in no time. And so we start asking these questions about like, okay, what does our new world mean, and how do we explain it? And so one of the things that security theorists were really concerned about is that people were mostly only concerned with explaining it in terms of the military, especially when we look at realism, but even liberalism to some degree. A lot of liberalism is focused on how international institutions interact with the military to like protect people's rights and stuff. And so then with the introduction of more and more critical theory, then our understandings of security broadened outside of just, is there war or not? Did we deploy troops or not? So that's a little bit what we talked about last time with our broadened analysis of what peace and stability look like. Just because we're not literally at war does not mean that we have peace and stability. And so one of the things then that we started to look at is, okay, so we've got these ideas of security. They probably shouldn't just be limited to the military. One of the things we also need to realize is that security is not like a yes-no question. So if we have a state, let's say like the United States, which is pretty secure as far as like foreign military incursion is concerned. We have some issues with potentially like Russian propaganda within the United States, debatable the degree to which that is true, but certainly it's not like we're worried Canada or Mexico is going to come invade. And so militarily speaking, we're the most secure country in the world by a long shot. But does that mean that everyone living in the United States is secure? No, definitely not. Feminist scholars have pointed this out, indigenous scholars have pointed this out, black scholars have pointed this out. There are lots of people living in the United States that live in a constant state of insecurity. So then what does security really mean in an international relations context? So this is what security theory seeks to answer, like the question that it's looking to answer. And one of the things that they came up with in order to answer this question is we just have to accept that security probably isn't ever universal, at least not the way that our current world works. They don't have a theory like realists where it's like it's impossible to make it universal, but rather it's not universal in our current state of affairs. And so treating a state as though it's secure or insecure means that we are going to miss all kinds of issues. So for example, if we view the United States as solely secure, the January 6th insurrection seems to come out of absolutely nowhere. It's just like, what is going on? And anybody who has friends or family outside of the United States probably experienced that. People texting you or snapping you or whatever, being like, what is going on? What is happening over there? And you're like, honestly though, kind of nothing. I'm fine. Nothing happened, but also kind of something. Because like, we did have a bunch of white supremacists try to kill a bunch of senators. And so like, that's not good. But yeah, and so if we try to answer this with a yes-no securitization question, it's like, so the lives of everyday people were not, generally speaking, super affected, at least not yet.
They saw the news.
They saw the news, basically. And like, the structure of our country didn't really change at all. There was no transition of power, but it was also still deeply unsettling. And so it's one of those like, if we try to make security a yes-no question, we'll never understand incidents like that. And if, especially we're talking about a global hegemon, then whether or not that country is secure becomes an everybody else's problem too. Especially when you end up with fascists in power and they feel the need to say, I don't know, annex territory, or go to war with people in order to create an enemy for their population to be more concerned with than their own problems. The other thing is that security is not neutral. And so oftentimes, security for some groups means insecurity for other groups. That's usually the way that oppressive structures operate within a given country. And so, oftentimes, that is then used to justify the insecurity of other people. And so, we see this a lot in the immigration debate in the United States. Immigrants are viewed as people who are like dangerous, they break drugs, they're taking our jobs, they're freeloaders, they're living off of our taxes and our health care, other things that are not true. And then this is then framed as a security threat to the good citizens of the good old US of A. And so now that the citizens of the United States have been threatened by these undocumented immigrants, that then justifies making undocumented immigrants insecure. We now police them more heavily. We created an organization in order to do it. They lack a lot of just basic human rights here in the United States, which is rather unique as it goes by developed countries. A lot of developed countries don't treat immigrants this way, as even undocumented ones. And so it then becomes a process of, okay, in order to keep X group secure, we have to make a Y group insecure. Now that is a false dichotomy. That's a false choice that is created by security apparatuses, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's important to recognize when we're talking about securitization in general, that oftentimes when we talk about making something or a group or a country more secure, from security theory's perspective, that usually is in the interest of justifying the insecurity of another group, of another state. Any questions about that? So a big part of that is that a lot of threats are constructed. That especially when we're talking about overly secure states like the United States, like, it's not that threats are not literally real. It's not that no threat ever has existed. They certainly do. But rather, they are often not nearly as bad as they are made out to be. And that is usually in the interest of justifying any action to get rid of the threat. Any questions before we move on to like our sort of big sectors that we'll talk about with security theory? All right, so there are 5 sort of major areas of like politics, international relations, etc., that security theory categorizes threats by. And this can be really useful for you when you're looking for links, especially in a 1AC, is don't think about just, did they call Russia a threat? Like, sure, that's a very obvious link argument that we can make. But if we look at it in terms of all of these different sectors, it's much easier to see the way that security politics manifests itself. And so we can also then give us context, because like each of these different areas has a different context. And so then when we talk in context of that area, it can often give us a lot more information than if we just think of security as immigrants are a threat, terrorists are a threat. Those are definitely security politics. But we also have that in terms of economics. This is incredibly common when we talk about like inflation these days. Or like the way that we talk about socialist democrats like Bernie Sanders and AOC. Bernie Sanders and AOC are not threats to American liberal politics as we know it. They're just not. They want to make some minor reforms and generally speaking leave the system as it is. But we don't talk about them that way. We have dramatically inflated the threat. And that's really difficult to understand if you don't understand the way that security apparatuses operate. Is that this threat has been inflated so that we can then say, okay, in order to keep the wealthy class in the United States secure, we have to make everybody else insecure by demonizing policies that might give them access to basic human rights like healthcare.
How could
And now we will also talk about things in all of these areas in very different ways. We talk about environmental existential threats in a very different way than we talk about political existential threats. That doesn't mean, though, that both of them can't be utilized to justify like violent military action. We saw this in Bolivia, where one of the reasons that the US gave for trying to coup the democratically elected and very popular leader of Bolivia was that he was destroying the Amazon rainforest, which is just not true. It is very true of the Brazilian president, who is like, you know, Trump's biffle. And so like, this then gets juxtaposed with, okay, so this person is an environmental threat. The Amazon rainforest is a crucial ecosystem, it's the lungs of the earth. We gotta get rid of this guy that's destroying it. Whoa, 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 that's just a false claim, first of all, that he's destroying it. Doesn't matter, we gotta get rid of him. It's like, okay, ha. And so while we might talk about these areas in different ways, they often have the same result. And so this is why we don't need, you know, 5 different impacts to a security critique. We can just have one, and that's okay. And we can still talk about the way that our alternative would solve links in any one of these sectors. Just looking at them through the lens of sectors can help us see links more clearly.
Is Biffle best friend forever for life?
Best friend for life.
What?
Best friend for life.
There's no vowels in that.
EFFL.
Oh, okay.
Now this is also, context is also super important just because like, sometimes threats are existential. They're just not existential to everyone. But then we act like they are in some really bizarre ways. So suicide bombings are one of the most popular examples of this, just because like, they occupied so much of the American imaginary for so long. Even though there were like, I don't think there's ever been like a large-scale suicide bombing in the United States. I think the largest scale suicide bombing in the West actually happened in France. But they did happen a lot in the Middle East. Usually aimed at US troops. Sometimes not though. And so one of the things that this then starts seeping into the American consciousness is this image of the suicide bomber. This like crazy brown person who is just like looking to take out as many good Christians as he can before, you know, on his jihad before he dies. Like that is literally the image that Americans had in their mind for forever, which made negative sense because they had never actually experienced that. Like some soldiers did, but that's about it. And so it was like not at all a threat to the average everyday person living in the United States. That didn't stop people from being terrified of it though, which was like comical looking back. Like more people died because of like bathtub electrocutions than they did from terrorist attacks between 2000 and 2015. Like it made no sense, but it was used to justify further military intervention. And so when a threat is just like, this makes negative sense, the first thing we need to ask is, okay, what is the threat being used to justify? Makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it?
I want to see the bathtub electrocution evidence.
Please stop using toasters in your bathtub.
Stop using bathtubs.
Have you ever seen those like toaster bath bombs on Etsy? They're so fun.
They're really funny.
Bath bomb shaped like a toaster.
Or the other way around. So, the questions that security theorists want us to ask when we're talking about like any type of security, whenever anybody brings it up, there are 3 questions that the security theorist wants to ask. Is security for whom? Who is being secured? Who is being kept safe? Security from what? What becomes the existential threat? And who becomes the target? And then security by whom? Usually government apparatuses. One fun fact, right before 9/11, one of the things that the military was going to do for like the first time ever was cut the crap out of its spending budget. Right before 9/11, the military was going to cut the crap out of its spending budget, and then 9/11 happened. And it's like, okay, well, guess that's never going to happen. Awesome.
Why is not?
So this gets us into what the process of threat construction looks like. And so threat construction is a rhetorical speech act. That is really critical when we're talking about the difference between like the security critique and other types of critiques. Now, that's not to say that other types of critiques can't critique rhetoric. They absolutely can. But when I say rhetorical speech act, when we talk about rhetoric, we're talking about what argument does something make. So when you do rhetorical analysis in like your English classes or on the AP English exam, you are looking for what argument does this piece of literature make. And so like these rhetorical speech acts can take a lot of different forms, but we're primarily analyzing the arguments that are made therein. And Security K is a little bit unique in this instance because the process of securitization is a rhetorical process. It's not a material one, like the process of disenfranchising the working class, or of like lynching black people, or of raping women. Like those are all very material things. But the securitization process is a rhetorical one that then has material consequences and material implications. Now, just like we talked about with Marxism, there are rhetorical elements to all forms of oppression. But security theory is a little bit unique in the sense that like the process of oppression itself starts fully rhetorical. And that's often what we mean when we say that like threats are constructed. It's not that these things don't literally happen, but rather the fact that they are a threat to whom we think they're a threat to whom is constructed. And that act happens through rhetoric. And so usually, the way that this works is we frame something as, or frame a threat specifically, as some form of extraordinary threat and some type of existential threat. So it has to be extraordinary in some way. That can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. But usually it's almost always existential. It is going to kill us all, or at least a lot of us. And so oftentimes then, that means that the actors who are doing, the securing, so we are our 3 questions, security by whom is doing the securing, are what are referred to as security apparatuses. And so these might be like the military, politics, sometimes NGOs, which gets really scary, some non-governmental organizations.
Oh, I'm smart, okay. It's too early.
Companies, like, sometimes it gets really gross.
Did Pepsi have like a full-on like army at one point?
I mean, a lot of private security is much more extensive than we want to believe.
They own the submarine.
Yeah.
Pepsi.
Oh, okay.
A singular submarine.
But these security apparatuses are then endowed with a similarly extraordinary power in order to deal with this threat. And oftentimes, these, what makes these powers extraordinary is that they violate a lot of the democratic norms that we would, hold to be standard in a way that's, totally unacceptable under any other circumstance. But because the threat is extraordinary and because it's existential, this then justifies the security apparatus acting in extraordinary ways.
Like martial law.
Yes.
But generally.
We had Hawaii under martial law for 3 years.
Wait, what? Wait, what?
Yeah. Or just the existence of the NSA. That's something that a lot of young millennials and Gen Z have just kind of grown up with, and so we don't think about it very often. But it's pretty wild when we think about it, especially when we compare it to the state of government surveillance prior to the NSA. So the government surveillance didn't happen, it absolutely did. That was Herbert Hoover's whole thing, is he was going to take out any threats to American democracy via draconian FBI surveillance and then eventually assassinations, usually extrajudicially. And that worked a lot. But the NSA then took this framework and just expanded it so dramatically, which should be terrifying whenever anybody thinks about it.
Remember Frank got a job offer from the NSA? Really, they just offer it to like people in college for math. They just like give you job offers.
So this is, then brings us to the phrase, reps shape reality, or representations shape reality. This is a phrase you'll hear 9 times out of 10 if you're debating a security team, and the 1 time out of 10 probably means you're not debating a very good security team. If you're reading the security K, you should be using this phrase, that representations shape our reality. So what we mean by this is that when you construct something as a threat, you then effectively do create a real threat. Not because the thing itself becomes any more threatening, but then because our reality dramatically changes and we give birth to new threats. So the quote-unquote threat of terrorist attacks on American soil, it's not, again, 9/11 didn't happen. Obviously, it absolutely did. It's a question of, okay, so 2,000 people died. Grand scheme of things, that's just not a lot of people. It was one time in one city. And it justified the most dramatic increase in military government spending and government programs that we have seen in decades. Like, we hadn't responded to anybody like terrorists like since we responded to like the communists. Like, it was next level stuff. And one of the reasons that, one of the things that then created was the suspension of a lot of democratic rights that people in the United States had, which became the new threat. And so when we say that representations shape reality, we don't literally mean that if I talk about Big Bird will appear right next to me. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how anything works.
It'd be kind of cool though.
It would be very cool if I could just manifest Big Bird.
Yeah.
But I can.
Out of all things, your power would just be manifesting Big Bird.
I think Big Bird, like a t-shirt dressed up as Big Bird, almost went on that one rocket that exploded. Like all of them.
Which
The
rocket
Challenger?
exploded?
The Challenger, I think.
I believe that. That would have been terrifying.
It was very close to having Big Bird die in a space mission.
I heard
On
that,
Children
I saw
Watch.
that.
Yeah, I did see something about that.
Yeah.
But the way that representations can also shape reality can work towards making things that were not once threats into threats. And so if we look at the history of US incursions in the Middle East, 9/11 starts making a lot more sense. It starts becoming damn right predictable, actually. One of the things that terrorists often have to do is resort to asymmetrical tactics because they are fighting somebody who is so much bigger and stronger than they are. And so, like, what can you do other than make political statements, basically? And that's what 9/11 primarily was. It was a political statement. It was a scare tactic. Some would say it didn't work, and some would say it very much did, depending on your perspective. But it then creates what we sometimes call blowback. And so when the United States goes and, say drone strikes the funeral of a terrorist organization, or terrorist head of an organization because they think that other terrorists are going to be at that funeral, what they also end up doing is killing a bunch of civilians who have families. Those civilians' families are now far more likely to join terrorist organizations because they think that that's the only repercussion, that's the only means of action that they have against the United States. And that's what we call blowback. And so that also then is the way that representations end up creating or shaping reality. And that's important because it creates both the problem and then the solution. So terrorists were not actually really a threat to the US. Really still aren't. But then we made them a threat by constructing them as such. And then we also gave people the solution to that threat, increased military response in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and said, hey, this scary thing is out here, but don't worry, we are going to protect you. We've got this. We're the United States federal government. It's going to be great.
Why can't we work on domestic?
Very serious people in very serious positions, very serious people.
Unfortunately, all of those things are true, and it doesn't make it any better. But then, this creates another sort of wrinkle. Okay, let's say I am the United States, and oops, I require threats to exist, especially with the way that my military is structured, because it is so much of my spending. And my citizens lack a bunch of access to basic human resources. And if I don't spend the military, if I don't give them a reason that we're shuttling all this money to the military, they might start to question that. So I need something that gives justification to all of the money we're spending on the military. Well, then if I keep getting rid of threats, that gets rid of the reason for the military spending. Okay. So now we have to create new threats, new different threats, which means that we are perpetually in this cycle of like existential threat. There is a new existential threat out there. And this is where we get into both the threats that are entirely constructed, like say immigrant caravans, which are just like a non-problem. They are not a problem at all. Literally nothing is bad. So back when Donald Trump was still in office, right before the COVID pandemic, I think it was right before the pandemic happened.
I think it was.
There was a caravan of immigrants coming from various places throughout South and Latin America that was going to like attempt to cross the U.S. border as asylum seekers. And Donald Trump painted this like it was going to be the most horrific thing to happen to the United States since like 9/11. Like, he was just like, they're coming for you, they're coming for your kids, they're coming for your families. It made negative sense. It was an absolute non-issue. And then we have threats that we created, like say China, where they probably would have been a non-issue, but then we just couldn't leave it alone. We just could not let them exist in peace. And so both of these threats then are things that the United States has to simultaneously deal with and keep alive in order to continue justifying spending on things like ICE or the military in general. And so then you end up with this hilarious, like, the United States is not only the most badass country that's ever existed because no threat can stand up to us, but also the worst country ever at dealing with threats somehow because they just keep popping up everywhere. And so in order to deal with this sort of dual-pronged narrative, we have to use rhetoric, use a bunch of ideological, rhetorical acts to create a different image of the United States as like the sole protector against the world's chaos. But this then creates what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, where we create threats like China. And so, those are the three phrases that should like make light bulbs go off in your head if you are debating a security K. Because you need to answer all of them. The answers to reps shape reality. Reps don't shape reality. We have those cards in the file. Answers to serial policy failure. You're like, no, you have to win the solvency debate in order to prove that. First of all, you have to have proven that the threat is not real, that it is totally constructed. Secondly, you have to actually answer solvency to prove that we're creating serial policy failure. You don't just get to assert that. And so as long as we win the solvency debate, serial policy failure doesn't matter. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, you have to win that the threat is actually constructed. And that it is not, in fact, something that is already happening. And then even if you win that the threat was originally constructed, and that's like the root cause of the threat, it doesn't matter, because the alternative is not what we call reverse causal. And that's highly debatable. People reading the security K will say, yes, it is reverse causal. People not reading the security K will say, no, it's not. And when we say reverse causal, what that means is that even if you win that securitization was the root cause of the threat, so like with China, that securitization created the threat that we see from China today, it doesn't make it magically go away if we stop securitizing against them. They're still island building, they're still going to invade Taiwan, they're still working with Russia, etc. And so even if like we caused the problem, it's like we're way past that now, and we have to do something about it. And so you should still vote affirmative. Whereas if you are negative, you're like, no, if we just left China alone, they would also leave us alone. And so having that debate in detail is very important. Now, one of the core things a security case says is that speech is always a political act. Nothing that you say. Technically all rhetoric is a rhetorical act, but security theory is very concerned with speech acts specifically. So we'll keep it to that sort of vein of analysis when we talk about the security critique. But they're always political acts. And so when we think about them, we have to think about, again, who are we securing? Against what? And by who? And so then what this process often looks like is there are a couple of simultaneous things that have to happen. We have to make something political, and we have to establish a regime of truth around that political thing. So let's go through the top one first. So we have something that is non-political. Let's say vaccinating your children. And so in order to then securitize against whatever we want to securitize against, we have to take vaccination from political, or from non-political to political. We have to make it political in some way. So vaccinations now cause autism. They infringe on parents' rights. They violate the bodily autonomy of babies, that sort of stuff. We have then made them political. They go from being a neutral, huh?
We've always vaccinated babies.
I thought we waited until like they were like, sorry.
We vaccinate babies, yes, that way they don't die.
Well, the
Yay.
babies have more rights than women. Sorry.
So, we've now taken it from being a non-political thing, a thing that's just neutral and everyone does, to a political thing, a thing that has right and wrong answers, a thing that like puts you on different sides of a political spectrum. That's what we mean by politicizing something. And then, we then have to securitize it. We then have to say, and also, it's because Bill Gates put chips in the COVID vaccine in order to surveil you, and he's going to give that information to the government. And they're going to use it to continue taking away your rights as parents, as gun owners, as white people, whatever. And so we've then taken it all the way from something that was just kind of standard and that everybody did, to one of the most hotly contested political debates of the day. Most issues exist somewhere on this spectrum. There are things that are not very political, like eat your fruits and veggies.
For now.
For now. For now, not very political. We'll see.
New government propaganda.
All the way over to socialists should be forced to leave the country because they're un-American. So, in order to actually then successfully take something from non-political to securitize, we have to establish a regime of truth around it. Now, this is definitely a strong lowercase t truth. There's nothing necessarily true about a regime of truth. It just becomes like the accepted narrative of the time. And so one of the ways that we went from being totally apolitical about communism to heavily securitizing against it was through different establishments of narratives around communism as a structure, around communist leaders especially. Like, we'll take the example of like Mao killed 1 million people. That's one of my favorites. It's so ridiculous. And so this is then goes towards establishing our regime of truth, is that communism kills. Just look at what happened in China. Look at Mao. He murdered people. He murdered 1 million people even. And so then, after we've established that communism kills, we have to establish a point of no return. And the point of no return is some type of event. Huh?
Like a song.
Yes. Like, it is some type of event or place in which it's like, if we let it get this far, it's too late. Then the communists will take over, and they'll get us all killed. And so, then, after we've established our point of no return, we have to establish a solution. What's the solution to this problem? It's that we should never adopt a policy that could even be remotely considered socialist, so we can keep ourselves as far away from communism as possible. So, it's important to note, Mao did not in fact kill 1 million people. There's no way to slice that statement that makes it true. But that doesn't matter when we're establishing our regime of truth.
For like the first like 8 years of my life.
Yeah.
It's something that we hear all the time, because it's part of our regime of truth. And so one of the things that's important about a regime of truth is it's not any single one isolated fact. It is a schema by which we are taught to think about something. We are taught to think that communism kills. And so we don't question whether or not Mao actually killed 1 million people. We're like, yeah, that checks out. We have all kinds of regimes of truth like this. One of the regimes of truth that we often have are anti-vaxxers are stupid. And so then when anti-vaxxers do stupid things, whether or not that's true, we don't question it. We're like, yeah, it fits into my regime of truth. It fits into this schema for me. And so I don't question it, even if it's categorically false. One of the memes that was getting shared a lot right before the 2016 election was a fake news interview, or a quote from a news interview that never happened between Donald Trump and I think it was Time magazine back in like the 80s. And supposedly what Trump had said was that, yeah, of course if I was going to run for office, I'd run in the Republican Party. Those people are idiots. They'll vote for anybody. Was supposedly the quote that was said. This did not happen, and this was absolutely not true.
I definitely never knew that. I did not know that was not true.
Yeah, it's not true at all. But everybody easily believed it was, because it fit the regime of truth, is that Donald Trump is a con artist who is just conning working class Republicans into voting for him. And so even if the regime of truth sometimes holds some truth to it, some actual truth, we then are led to believe all kinds of things that aren't true, just because they fit into our regime of truth. And this is then what easily allows people to establish a point of no return. We don't even have to say something that's all that like we can say anything we want. Like, we don't have to say anything that's anywhere near the truth, as long as it fits within the regime. And that allows us to establish our point of no return, and then our solution.
So this could be like something that's even slightly short. It could be something that's literally like an opinionated thing that a person believes.
Exactly. But if it fits within your regime of truth, you're not likely to question it. One of the sort of less political places we see this all the time is like nutrition. Is people want to believe that there are certain foods that are healthy and some foods that are unhealthy. And if they eat healthy foods, they will live longer, be happier, be healthier, yay. But that's not really how anything works. And so then when a study comes out that says, like, actually, did you know that people who eat a pound of broccoli every day don't live any longer? People are like, well, that doesn't fit within my regime of truth, so I'm going to ignore that. I continue to believe that broccoli is healthy and will make me live forever.
But that exercise makes you lose weight.
Also not really true. And so then what we often see is a really good way to know what your regime of truth looks like is when you are presented with a piece of evidence, do you actually question it or not? Or do you just take it at face value? And so when you're presented with a piece of evidence that says eating an ounce of chocolate a day will make you live longer or something, and you're like, great, awesome. I suspect you eat a lot of chocolate already, or that you would like to eat a lot of chocolate, and so you would like to believe that that is a thing that is going to help you live longer. Whereas if you see an article that's like, every hot dog you eat takes a day off your life, you're like, well, that sounds awfully hyperbolic. Let me look into this. Okay, that's not actually what the study said. You're treating these pieces of evidence very differently depending on what you want to believe to be the case. And so that's how we can know when something is part of our regime of truth or not. How much critical thinking do we actually apply to this new piece of evidence or this new data point in our lives? How much questioning do we do? Because we should be questioning everything. You should question the hot dog study, because that's not true. It's not what the science actually said. It's just the hyperbolic headline that some reporters gave. But the same thing happened with that study about chocolate. That is not what the chocolate study said. It was a hyperbolic headline created by reporters. And so when we never question either of these things, we end up believing a bunch of stuff that's just not true in both directions. Now, one of the things that some IR scholars believe is if we can make this process more transparent, if we can point out when this is happening, then the general population is far more likely to be reasonable and moderate their responses to these quote-unquote threats. Because nobody likes to be tricked, basically, is a lot of the argument. And so people become hostile to those that they believe have tricked them. And so that was one of the things that was happening with a lot of people once we found out that, Iraq definitely never had weapons of mass destruction, and the government probably knew that even. Is people were like, wow, I don't really trust my government anymore, for obvious reasons. And so security scholars thought that if we could point out when this was happening, it would be much easier to stop it. And so when you're describing the alt to the security critique, this can be part of it. It's just like, even just making this process more transparent will make desecuritization far more effective. Because then people will actually see what's going on instead of just accepting a regime of truth.
So are you saying this could be part of an alternative itself, or it can be part of the one that we have now, like the total refusal one?
So yeah, it can be part of the total refusal one. That part of total refusal is making this process transparent so that we don't keep engaging in security politics. Now, a couple of additional things when we're talking about our regime of truth. Usually the regime of truth, in order to be effective in mobilizing political and then eventually securitizing action, has to establish some kind of us versus them dichotomy. If there is no enemy, if there's no one to fight, then it's very difficult to mobilize a security apparatus. And so that's also a clue that you should be looking for in different affirmatives. Where have we created an us versus them dichotomy? Because you can make that its own link argument. Like, you can call it the us versus them link and talk about the way that creating that enemy, constructing that threat, then justifies any action in response. And so even if the affirmative isn't taking an inherently bad action, the way that they have framed the threat itself will justify actions far beyond the affirmative. You can also look for points of no return that are established in a 1AC. Basically, every app has to have this. They have to have a brink argument. So where is the brink argument? And what does it say? Does it say that somebody else has crossed some kind of point of no return? I anticipate that they will, about Russia especially. That they will say that Russia has crossed the line. They are officially like authoritarian revisionists who are trying to tear down the liberal world order. And so that then justifies exceptional actions against them of any kind. And so that is when we can start looking for, like, okay, where is the point of no return in the 1AC, and what exactly does it say? And that can become a separate link argument.
I can't get the song out of my head.
Now, generally speaking, the solution that's established is usually a military one. If we frame the threat as existential, the military is often the only option as far as solutions go. That's not always true, and we can find cases where that's not true, but 9 times out of 10, it's the military.
Like this is like generic, like literally the military, or like military like things.
Like
Does
military,
this
yeah,
include,
like
ICE or?
yeah, this would definitely include like ICE. Although one of the things that Trump did suggest at one point was invading Mexico to stop immigrants from coming over.
That's gonna work well.
Yeah, I don't know.
We did it once.
We took Texas from them, because that worked out so well for us.
Yeah,
So-
can we give it back?
So we're talking about securitizing actors. One of the things that we need to discuss is who is doing the actual securing. We said it's the state a whole bunch of times, but these are all of the things that can play a role in securitization. So we do have like politicians, police officers, immigration facilities, intelligence agencies like the CIA, like all kinds of different, like literally the state apparatuses, which would include the military, that sort of stuff. So those are the most obvious ones. But we also then have any actor who can change the securitization process, who has the direct power to influence that. And so that might also be like, say, the Supreme Court. They're not technically politicians, or they're not supposed to be at least. And so they would also, though, be part of what we call the security apparatus in the United States, or a securitizing actor.
Partisan judges? What? It's so totally unbiased.
Now, one of the things that's important for these security actors to do is to frame knowledge as only objective. There is a capital T truth, and I have it, which means I have the right knowledge and the right solution to the problem. Now, sometimes this can put security actors in conflict with one another, especially if they do have like disparate short-term goals. Generally speaking, not so much though, because their like goal is always securitization, and so usually it doesn't put them in too much conflict with one another. Sometimes it does. So we have securitizing actors, and then we have functional actors. Functional actors can be considered part of the security apparatus as well. But these are people who don't have the direct power to change security policy. They don't have the power to change military spending. They don't have the power to deploy border patrol or anything like that. And those would be people in like the media, academia, think tanks, non-governmental organizations, corporations. These are people that cannot directly influence policy, but they can contribute to the rhetorical speech act of securitization. And so oftentimes they will focus on the us versus them dichotomy and play it up a lot. Like turn on a Tucker Carlson skit, well, they're not skits, they should be considered skits. Turn on a Tucker Carlson segment anytime you want to see this in action, or listen to the Joe Rogan podcast.
Didn't this lawyer or him say in court that no reasonable person could take him as being serious?
Yes, that's why they're definitely skits, but whatever. And so sometimes this is like the media in general. So this is what we saw a lot right after 9/11. Is there wasn't a lot of distinction between conservative and liberal media at that point. It was all just like, we got attacked. Go get the terrorists. Yikes. And because we had then created this regime of truth around terrorists who just like hated Americans for unknowable reasons, as well as a regime of truth around, say, Saddam Hussein is like the most evil man to have ever lived, it was super easy for people to just accept the fact that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction into that regime of truth. You're like, sure, I believe that. That makes sense. And that was it. That was all it took. But they can also include individual people, like Tucker Carlson. So, some shortcomings to security theory. They don't focus very much on why. Why do we securitize against specific individuals other than just to engage in military action, to justify the military's existence? It's like, sure, I get that. But why these people? Why not different people? Why don't we securitize against different people? And so securitization theory is often not concerned with that, like, why this group question. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The security IR theorists are mostly concerned with the process of securitization and how it happens. But this can serve to like mystify larger structures of oppression, and so then we're focused on only the process of securitization and not stopping the source for insecurity, which is often those structural systems of oppression. And so like one of the things that's super interesting is that like the IRA actually killed that's the terrorist group in Ireland.
Yes, I've heard of this one.
Yeah, so the IRA has killed a lot more Europeans than any brown terrorist organization has, but they are way more concerned about like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Why is that? That's interesting. I wonder if it's because it's racist. And so like, these things don't necessarily make a ton of sense if we don't also take larger structures into account, which sometimes security studies just doesn't. Now there's no reason that you don't have to when you debate, like you can just make that analysis and that's okay. And so like just don't fall into that trap, and it's much easier for us to get around. The other problem is, what if a threat is real? What if somebody is actually coming for us? And so if like I was living in Cuba and somebody was like, God, you gotta stop constructing the United States as like a threat. Like, you're just making it worse. I'd be like, they tried to invade us and have had us under like crippling economic sanctions for decades. What do you mean they're not a real threat? And so that like gets complicated, and that's why you have to win that the threat that the affirmative has described isn't real. Or is at least not nearly as bad as they've made it sound, in order to actually win your epistemology claims on the security critique. And so like, context really matters a lot here. So like, when the app is like, obviously Russia is a real threat, they invaded Ukraine, you're like, sure, okay, why does that make them a threat to us? Draw me the line between an invasion of the Ukraine and attacking the United States. That through line does not exist. And so that's why context can matter a lot. Just because Russia is obviously a threat to someone does not mean that they are a threat to us. And then how can we know that? And so that's where the process of debate comes in for us. And so this gets us to a bunch of different ways that we can use this on the NATO topic specifically. Is that like NATO is an attempt to securitize against Russia. It was literally started to securitize against the USSR. And so like, is it so surprising that this is the state of affairs today? No, not really. But just like with every other critique that we've talked about, it is not enough to say, did you know NATO was started to securitize against Russia? Wow, what a great FYI. That's not a link argument. But that can be a source for analysis or research, especially. Research is where that sort of historical knowledge becomes very helpful when you're looking for those specific link arguments. Zero policy failure, always big. And so like, assuming that we take the affirmative solution, what potential serial policy failure arguments could we make? And so if we say Russia is a threat, we gotta shore up our allies, it's like, well, gee whiz, maybe then we embolden our allies and we make the conflict worse. If France thinks that the US has its back, it's far more likely to do some stuff than if it thought that it was not backed by the largest military power in the world. It would be a whole lot less likely to do some stuff. And so potentially shoring up our allies could actually make the problem worse. And this is a very similar thing with self-fulfilling prophecies. It's like, okay, if we do shore up our allies, does that then actually make Russia feel more threatened? Do they then think that we are gearing up for a bigger counteroffensive? And you can apply that in a whole bunch of different circumstances. And so it really will just come down to, what are the advantages of the 1AC? What regime of truth can I identify in the 1AC? What has been securitized? What is being secured? Who is going to do that securing? Where is the point of no return in the app? What solution have they proposed to the point of no return? What potential problems could that solution happen? Now, a lot of the ways that it's easy to come up with what potential problems could that solution have is just to know a lot about the history of securitization. And so if you're really interested in making this a core part of your strategy next year, I would highly recommend doing some reading over the summer that's just like, when has stuff like this happened in the past and what did it cause? So obviously like the war on terror is sort of the most prescient recent example of this. Is like, okay, we did a lot of securitization against places like Iraq, Afghanistan, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, these specific groups as well. What has that caused? What has that created in our modern age? It has created a crumbling infrastructure in the Middle East. It has created rampant xenophobia in both the United States and Europe. It has contributed to the military becoming ever increasingly large and unnecessary, thus taking away resources from the people actually living in the United States. It has caused massive deaths, that sort of stuff.
And the war on drugs.
The war on drugs is a very similar example, yes. It was just like, okay, so we started securitizing against black people. What does that cause?
Also Mexican people.
Also Mexican people, that's true. They're the ones who brought the good old MJ. Fun fact, marijuana was perfectly legal in the United States until Mexican immigration increased. Yes, so then when you look at those from a historical perspective, it's then much easier to say, okay, this is what the affirmative is trying to do. What do I think that could cause someday? And then make those part of my link story and or impact story.